Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this Radcast, the Guy, Fawkes, and Jamen series. And we're going to pick right up where we left off on the last episode. And I'm going to, in addition to welcoming you both back, Guy and Fawkes, I'm going to turn it right over to Fawkes because you'd really set it up nicely for us towards the end of the last episode. So on to you, Fawkes, and then on to you, Guy, and we'll kick it off.
Okay, thank you. The topic of personal property and personal identity, I think, as you said there in the interim, Jamin, is so intimately, inexorably tied up together that taking the two on, I think, is a good way to go. And as always, I think some historical context is in order, some of which I tried to provide in the last session. But I'll just say, in regards to the historical context, is that what we've been increasing now since historical transition from feudalism to capitalism is a heightening sense of self as sort of the basic building block of society, where the societal underpinnings, really the foundation of individual identity, becomes repressed. And we go so far, we've gone so far as to enshrine the individual in laws, and particularly in terms of personal property rights. And why is that so? Well, it's complicated. I'm not a historian, but I think a basic answer that there's a lot of consensus on amongst historians is that the class of people who essentially revolutionized society by transforming the moated economy certainly had an Enlightenment notion. I should use Enlightenment in quotation marks of the self. So, for example, you had Descartes, who posited this Cartesian sense of I think, therefore I am. He actually would sit in a white room so he could be alone with himself, and said that was the starting point for a new philosophy, which by and large has been accepted, at least culturally. And so the self kind of becomes this monad floating in space upon which everything else depends. And so there's a number of things that are compounded there: individual identity, and the right to own property, and particularly a piece of the earth, right? Before, you had this feudalistic system where you had the overlords, right, who again owned property, right, and were in the business of guarding their domains. And of course, there were people who worked the land. And so, it was, I suppose we could say, natural that those who rose up to displace that class were focusing on their own personal right to own property. That may have been, well, I would argue that it was a serious misstep. And we saw that transition was not at all smooth, that there were revolutions and counter-revolutions and all sorts of struggles to see who would, in the end, be ascendant, what class, and the lower classes, the working classes, were always more communally minded. But this burgeoning bourgeois class said, no, it's not so much that we want to overturn the notion of personal property, as many argued for at that time. It was one of the competing ideals, But they said instead of overcoming personal property as such, because look at what it's done to humanity, where you have these overlords, and then the rest of us slaves and servants. We want a piece of the pie too. We want to own our own piece of property so we can be our own lords and even have the possibility to rule it over others, the underlings, those who don't have the wherewithal to own property for themselves. And through the historical struggle, that's the direction that, by and large, society has gone, not only in the Western world, but now more or less the world over. So that what we have here is a capitalistic system dependent upon this notion of personal property that says basically, this is mine, and I have more than you, therefore I'm better than you, more powerful. And if you want a chance of survival, then you can always go to work for me. So basically, just taking the old model and somehow, quote unquote, democratizing it. Well, arguably, that's not democracy at all, because what it essentially does is just replaces an old hierarchy with a new one. So I think that just provides some framing. I'm sure there's other ways to frame it and different directions we could go with it. But here we are. Some of us own more than others. And what's, I guess, most important is, my right to own property. Although I will point out that when Jefferson penned the Declaration of Independence, he was very much drawing upon the Enlightenment philosophers, in particular John Locke, who stipulated that the new Trinity was going to be life, liberty, and property. Jefferson notably changed that last one because he thought it sounded a bit too crude, which it is, to the pursuit of happiness. But the underlying philosophy, the new Holy Trinity, as it were, is basically that the individual life, okay, liberty, okay, but property, why would that be the case? Well, because the whole new mode of production was based upon that premise. So I'll stop my monologue and turn it over to you two.
There's so much there.
Yes.
I mean, there really is. You introduced the idea of individuality within the concept of ownership. Basically, I am what I own. And Jefferson was too crude to put that in the founding document for the United States, but the message was still transmitted. I am what I own. This is what makes me who I am. This is my sense of individuality. The Greek cynics, and going back even further to say the first 2.8 million years of the human experience, from Homo erectus forward until really the last few thousand years, this sense of community, the sense of communal ownership and stewardship rather than ownership was the dominant narrative. The dominant narrative that we are not, we don't inherit the planet from our fathers and our forefathers. We are caretaking it for future generations. That's the mentality that was in place for millions of years. And then the civilization shows up. We start growing grains at scale. Wham, all of a sudden, some sociopath can control the people by controlling the food. And, well, what do you know? Here we are determining who gets to have the most grain, who gets to have the most food, who gets to have the most power. And that notion of individuality is hand in glove with the notion of ownership. What is mine? Who am I? What's the separation between me and you? Where does my power come from? Mostly my power over you. So yeah, we sort of left feudalism and turned it into a democracy, or at least a republic. But I'm not sure that the contemporary version of republic is very far removed from the notion of feudalism. Jamen, your thoughts about that?
Yeah, I really appreciated the parallels that Guy made, because I used to see this huge chasm of philosophy between feudalism and capitalism, et cetera, et cetera. But thanks to your brilliant introduction, Fawkes, I actually really see them as just different shades of gray of the same fundamental philosophy, which is a philosophy of separation, ownership. This is mine, this is yours. It's just, who's the owner? Is it some feudal overlord, or is it some wealthy nouveau riche bourgeois who, you know, now owns some land and has their own, essentially, you know, slaves of sort? And if we thought that we had shed this idea of slavery back in, you know, feudalism times, well, perish the thought. We had them all the way to, you know, the capitalistic, though with strong undertones of feudalism in the south of the United States. As little as 160 years ago with slavery. And so the very fact that we were able to dial back and retreat from this idea of being able to own other people, and now we're back to property, it gives me tremendous hope that we will also be able to dial back this ownership of property and go back towards a much more communal, which I think is vital for our survival now, that we see the world as one spaceship, that no one can carve it up and own it and destroy their portion of it and say, it's mine, therefore I can do what I want with it. The realization that that's killing all of us is growing. So I am extremely optimistic that this will be able to be a very fluid conversation amongst humanity as we figure out our way out of this quagmire. Back to you, gentlemen.
Yeah, it's what I've referred to before, at least with you, Jamen, as overlapping modes of production. That one doesn't just simply, you know, replace the other. There are certain things that we have held on to from prior modes of production, not only the feudalistic, but even before that. For example, a lot of the major, you know, world religions themselves came from prior modes of production, depending very much upon the societal structures that were put in place at that time, and, you know, used ideologically and otherwise to, you know, reinforce, to sort of prop up that way of life. And so, you know, that one harkens back even farther. And there's nothing wrong with harkening back to prior modes of production, because different modes of production or different, whatever we want to call them, you know, epochs have value, things that we can learn from. But going back to the beginning, whatever that means, I'll just say prior to the Neolithic, you know, revolution, which was really a fall into, you know, this hierarchical structure, you know, sort of the lost of paradise. The thing we see there with these societies, of which there were still many that, you know, we have in recorded history. There may even be some that still exist today, but barely. But we've been able to observe that, you know, there's certain things that these groups got right that, frankly, we need to get back to. Not that we need to simply revert back to that as though that were possible, but to say, you know what, this whole owning property thing isn't working for society as a whole, right? It's certainly not democratic in the sense of the demos, meaning the people, and it's not working for the planet upon which we all depend. And so the system itself is fundamentally flawed. Arguably, the original sin was ownership, not in the sense that, you know, we all share the same toothbrush, but which is often the, you know, that's often the counter argument to say, oh, well, you know, if everything's, you know, if everything's everybody's, then, you know, then give me the shirt off your back. You know, that really sidesteps is kind of a head fake, if you will, to address the fundamental dynamic of society. as it functions today and has for thousands of years. But returning to that sense of the collective, right? That's what we keep coming back to on this show. But by subsuming, in a sense, reintegrating the individual and everything that we've gained in terms of personal, rights, not that we want those to go away, valuing the individual as such, and we can have a conversation, I imagine we will, about, what does it mean to be an individual? That would certainly be fascinating, if not philosophical. Being able to say, okay, you know what, there's a lot of great things from each and every one of these modes of production throughout history, these different ways of relating to one another. Even the feudalistic had certain things that frankly were better than the capitalistic. But I'll just say one more thing before passing the baton over, is that this whole notion of the pursuit of happiness basically being a thinly veiled version of Locke's right to personal property is very much undermined by decades of social science research that shows after a certain point, personal wealth doesn't make you happier. This has been validated over and over again through a number of different studies, different kinds of studies. And therefore, if pursuit of happiness is a basic, right, or at least the pursuit of it, then we cannot we cannot say that means we can accumulate as much wealth as we, want at the expense of others. And that's by and large what has been happening for a long time to the detriment of people on the planet.
Excellent point. I think I'm sure we will be accused of trying to revert to socialism, as if that's an answer, as if that has worked so swimmingly well, and that's not what we're talking about here. We're not talking about abandoning capitalism, and instead promoting socialism. We're really talking about taking responsibility, at least from my perspective. The way the current system is structured, 8 people have the same wealth, the same monetary wealth as half the people on the planet. If that's okay with you, then maybe you're part of the problem here. If the notion of happiness for you is rooted in the notion of personal property, is rooted in ownership, then I think, Houston, we have a problem. And I recognize, as Nietzsche did, that evolution through natural selection drives us towards, first of all, flight or fight, towards our own survival, and then towards procreation, towards making copies of ourselves. Genetically, just like with other organisms, that's what we're really driven to do. And then third, to the accumulation of material possessions. And at the end of his writing career, Nietzsche actually gave up on the idea, or appeared to give up on from my perspective, on the notion of the Superman or the Ubermensch, the Overman, who was able to overcome his evolutionary instincts and set aside things like personal survival for another day and accumulation of material possessions. So this is a conversation that has been going on for a really long time, and really is a discussion, a conversation that has filled tomes of philosophy since what we recognize as philosophy came into being, dating all the way back to the Greek cynics, going right through as a common thread in Nietzsche's writing and Schopenhauer's. And here we are today talking about the same kinds of things that have plagued society for at least the last few thousand years. What do we propose as something different? Not socialism. I don't think anybody wants to return to tribalism in the absence of electricity, much less clever devices that allow us to have this conversation. I think what we're seeking, and the means by which we're seeking it, is this notion of coming together as individuals, in groups, ultimately as a human species, as Homo sapiens, as humanity, on behalf of the common good. And defining that and identifying the path by which we get there is not something the three of us are going to outline in 28-minute episodes of video. It's something that's much larger than the three of us. If the predicament in which we're embroiled is so great that it requires a transformation of humanity at a fundamental and yet overarching level, then let's get on with it. Let's not just say, oh, that's a pretty big job, I'm going to leave that to somebody else. Let's everybody, all hands on deck. It's certainly past time for that. Let's get with it. Totally.
Couldn't agree more. Couldn't agree more. And since we've talked a fair amount of philosophy, I'll paraphrase Marx, which I credit Fawkes with reminding us of, that philosophers interpret the world. The point is to change it.
I think we've had a century of self as identified in a documentary film with the same name. It's time now for the future to not so much lose that sense of self as recognize that ourselves are part of something much larger.
Beautiful, beautiful. All right, with that, gentlemen, shall we wrap and then carry on with the next one? Very good. All right, we'll see you on the next one. Thanks so much, everyone, for watching. We'll see you on the next episode.